The battlefield was silent. Smoke still floated in the cold night air. The war had ended only hours ago, leaving broken machines and lifeless bodies scattered across the dark plain. Among the ruins walked a young soldier named Kale. He was tired, his armor scratched, his hands shaking from days without proper rest. He searched the ground not for glory, but for survival. Food, water, or maybe something useful to trade. As Kale stepped over fallen beams and twisted metal, his eyes caught a strange glimmer. It was weak, barely visible in the ash, but it pulled his attention. Curious, he brushed the dirt away and found an old sword. The blade was rusty, its surface cracked and dull. It did not shine like the weapons of modern soldiers, yet there was something about it that felt alive. Kale frowned, wondering why such an old relic lay here in the middle of a futuristic battlefield. He reached down and touched it. The moment his fingers brushed the blade, he froze. A whisper entered his mind, soft but clear. "The Emperor lives again," it said. Kale pulled his hand back quickly, his heart racing. He looked around to see if anyone else had heard it, but the night was silent. Only the sound of wind and the distant crackle of fires. The sword lay still, unmoving, yet Kale's hand tingled as if the voice had burned into his skin. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination. The battlefield always played tricks on the mind. Still, he could not leave the sword behind. Something deep inside told him this blade was important. Hesitating only a moment longer, Kale picked it up. The weight felt wrong, too heavy for its size, as if it carried more than metal. Yet when he held it tight, the whisper came again, softer this time. "The Emperor waits." Kale stumbled back, nearly dropping the sword. His breath quickened, and he wanted to throw it away. But his fingers refused to let go. It was as if the sword itself demanded to stay in his hand. He shook his head, whispering to himself that he was just tired. He slipped the weapon into his pack and hurried back toward camp. The shadows around him felt thicker, as if the night itself had changed after he touched the blade. When Kale reached camp, the other soldiers barely noticed him. Everyone was too exhausted, too broken from battle. They sat by weak fires, cleaning wounds and staring at the ground. Kale dropped his bag in a corner and tried to rest. But as he lay down, he felt the sword vibrating faintly against the metal of his armor. It was not a sound, not even a true movement, just a pulse like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, ancient. That night he dreamed. He saw a throne made of stone and fire. On it sat a tall figure in black armor, his face hidden in shadows. The man's voice echoed through the dream, deep and powerful. "You have awakened me," it said. Kale tried to speak but found no words. The figure rose, drawing a blade that burned with golden light. But when Kale looked closer, he realized it was the same rusty sword he now carried. He woke with a start, sweat dripping down his face. The camp was quiet, but the sword pulsed again, as if confirming the dream was real. Kale sat up, staring at the weapon with wide eyes. He whispered to himself, "What are you?" No answer came. Yet in his heart, he already knew. This was no ordinary sword. It was something ancient, something dangerous, and whatever lived inside it had just chosen him. From that night onward, Kale could not escape the whispers. Sometimes they were quiet, like wind in the distance. Other times they were sharp, commanding. "The Emperor lives again." They repeated over and over. Kale tried to ignore them, but deep down, a terrible curiosity grew. Who was this Emperor, and why was he speaking to him through an old blade? The war outside might have ended, but Kale's true battle was only beginning. The camp was quiet when Kale returned, but inside his head, the whispers never stopped. Even when he tried to rest, the voice of the sword echoed faintly, always repeating the same words. "The Emperor lives again." At first, Kale thought it was only his imagination, the trick of exhaustion and war. But the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the whispers grew. They came in the silence of the night. They came when he closed his eyes, and sometimes they came even in the middle of conversation with other soldiers. It was as if the blade had become part of him, bound to his mind. Days passed, but Kale could not find peace. When he carried the sword, it pulsed faintly, almost like a living thing. Sometimes it felt warm in his hands, sometimes cold as ice. The whispers were never loud enough for others to hear, yet they filled Kale's thoughts with unease. He began to dream more often of the throne, the shadowy figure, and the glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Each dream ended the same way, with a voice declaring, "The Emperor waits," and Kale waking up drenched in sweat. One night, unable to sleep, Kale left his tent and walked into the ruins nearby. The battlefield stretched endlessly, broken machines like giant skeletons sleeping under the moonlight. The sword guided him, or maybe he guided himself. He could not tell the difference anymore. Every step seemed to follow the rhythm of the whispers, pulling him deeper into the destroyed city. When he reached the center of the ruins, he felt the blade pulse harder, and the whisper became almost a command. "Here!" Kale stopped in front of a collapsed wall, half buried in sand and ash. It looked ordinary at first, just another ruin from the endless war. But when he touched the stone, it trembled slightly, as though it remembered something ancient. The sword in his hand vibrated, and the whisper grew louder. Beneath, Kale's heart raced. He looked around, afraid that someone might see him. Yet the ruins were empty. Only the dead and the shadows remained. He knelt and began to dig with his hands. The dirt was cold and heavy, but he refused to stop. Minutes turned into hours as the moon moved across the sky. Finally, his fingers touched something hard, smooth, and carved with strange markings. He pulled harder, revealing a hidden stone door covered in symbols that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The sword hummed like it had been waiting for this moment. Kale felt his chest tighten, fear mixing with curiosity. When he placed the blade against the door, the symbols flared to life. A soft light spread across the carvings, forming a pattern that looked like wings of fire. The door shifted, releasing a deep echo that sounded more like a breath than stone. Dust fell as the hidden passage revealed itself, leading down into darkness. Kale's heart pounded. Part of him wanted to run back, to pretend this never happened. But the whispers kept pushing him forward. Enter. The passage was cold, the air filled with the smell of age and silence. Kale lit a small torch, the flame flickering nervously against the black walls. Carvings covered the stone, pictures of battles long past, armies bowing to a single figure. The Emperor. His presence seemed to watch Kale through the drawings, his eyes glowing even in simple etchings. As Kale walked deeper, the whispers became clearer, almost words he could understand. Fragments of sentences, promises of power, warnings of betrayal. He stumbled, his mind dizzy from the weight of voices pressing into him. At the end of the passage, he found a chamber, vast and silent. In its center stood a great stone table, and above it a mural painted across the ceiling. The painting showed the Emperor holding the very same sword, his enemies broken before him. Kale stepped closer, and the whispers became a roar. "You are chosen." Kale dropped the torch, its light rolling across the floor, shadows dancing wildly on the walls. His knees trembled, his throat dry. He could no longer tell if the voice was in his head or filling the entire chamber. The blade pulsed again, stronger than ever. Kale gripped it tightly, and for a moment he thought he felt a hand over his, guiding him, cold, powerful, ancient. The chamber seemed to shift around him, the walls breathing, the mural glowing. He saw visions, armies kneeling, worlds burning, stars falling from the sky, and always the Emperor at the center, his figure towering, unstoppable. Kale gasped, pulling himself back, dropping the sword to the floor. The visions vanished, but the whispers remained, softer now, almost comforting. The Emperor lives again. Kale stood in the dark chamber, his heart pounding like a drum. He stared at the sword lying before him, afraid to touch it, yet unable to leave it behind. The war outside had ended, but inside this ruin, a new war had begun. A war tied not to nations or machines, but to him, to the blade, and to the Emperor who whispered through the rust. Kale returned to the chamber the next night, though fear weighed heavily on his steps. The ruins above were silent, but in the darkness below the sword whispered without rest. It called him to the mural, to the stone table, to the secrets buried in the earth. Kale knew he should tell someone, but who would believe him? A rusty blade, speaking with the voice of an emperor, sounded like madness. Yet each time he tried to ignore it, the sword seemed to burn against his skin, reminding him that this was no dream. The chamber felt alive. The walls carried echoes of battles long past. The drawings of the Emperor seemed to move when Kale wasn't looking, their eyes glowing faintly as though painted with fire. Kale raised the blade toward the mural, and suddenly the chamber responded. The carvings lit up, filling the room with golden lines of energy. A low hum shook the ground beneath his feet. The voice of the Emperor grew louder than ever, no longer a whisper, but a steady command. You will know the truth. Kale stumbled back, his heart racing. The blade grew warm, glowing faintly in the torchlight. Images flooded his mind, visions of a time long before his birth. He saw the Emperor standing tall on a battlefield, armies kneeling before him, banners waving in the storm of war. The Emperor's eyes glowed like suns, and his voice carried across the stars. But Kale also saw betrayal, figures in the shadows, allies turning into enemies, chains of light binding the Emperor, forcing his spirit into the sword. The whispers filled with anger and sorrow. They feared me, they trapped me, but I will rise again. Kale dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The visions burned into his thoughts like fire. He could feel the Emperor's rage, but also his strength, his pride, his unshakable will. When the visions faded, Kale gasped for air. He realized his hands were shaking not from fear, but from the weight of destiny. The blade did not just carry a voice, it carried a soul. And that soul belonged to a ruler who once commanded worlds. Kale staggered back toward the stone table. There were carvings etched into it, words in an old language. Though Kale had never studied such things, he found he could read them, as if the sword itself translated. The Emperor's spirit rests within this blade, awaiting the one strong enough to wield it, awaiting the one bold enough to free him. Kale's stomach twisted. Was he the one chosen to release this ancient power, or only the fool unlucky enough to touch it? He pressed his hand against the stone and felt it respond. The ground shifted, revealing more of the chamber hidden below. Steps led down into deeper darkness. Kale hesitated, but the whispers urged him forward. Do not fear. Your path is already written. He took the steps slowly, torchlight flickering against walls covered with murals of the Emperor's victories. Each one showed him more clearly. The same face, the same glowing eyes, the same blade. At the bottom of the steps, Kale found another hall, this one filled with statues of warriors, kneeling in eternal silence. In the center stood a throne made of stone and metal, cracked but still magnificent. The sword pulsed harder in Kale's hand, almost dragging him forward. As he approached, the air grew colder, heavy with ancient power. He felt as though 1,000 unseen eyes were watching. The whispers filled the hall, louder and louder. Bow before your Emperor. Kale fell to his knees, not by choice but by force. The pressure was unbearable, like the weight of mountains pressing down on his shoulders. The sword glowed brighter, filling the hall with golden light. The statues seemed to stir, their stone faces turning slightly, as though alive. Kale tried to speak, to resist, but his voice broke in his throat. The Emperor's voice thundered through him. You have seen betrayal. You have seen my fall, but you will also see my return. The light faded, the weight lifted, and Kale collapsed to the ground, gasping. His torch flickered weakly, but the sword still glowed, faint and steady. Kale stared at it, his mind spinning. He understood now. The Emperor had been sealed away by those who feared his power. The sword was no relic. It was a prison, and Kale had become its key. His heart pounded with fear, yet also with something dangerous, a sense of purpose. For the first time in his life, Kale felt chosen. And though he did not know whether the Emperor was savior or tyrant, one truth was clear. The Emperor's secret was no longer buried. It lived in the whispers of the blade, and in Kale's trembling hands. The whispers of the sword no longer belonged to Kale alone. Though no one else could hear the voice, the strange glow of the blade began to draw attention. In the camp, soldiers whispered about him, saying his eyes seemed different, his steps heavier, his nights restless. Some claimed they saw a light flickering from his tent, as if fire danced without flame. Others swore that Kale spoke in his sleep with words that belonged to no human tongue. Rumors spread quickly, and soon they reached ears beyond the ruined battlefield. The enemies of Kale's people, broken but not defeated, sent scouts to investigate. They had heard of the blade and old legends, stories of the Emperor who once ruled with unshakable might. And now whispers returned. Rumors that a soldier had found the weapon, that the Emperor's spirit stirred once more. To them, it was not superstition, it was a warning. For they remembered the Emperor not as a savior, but as a conqueror. They feared his return, and they knew the sword must be destroyed before its secret grew too strong. Kale felt the danger long before he saw it. The sword pulsed at his side, restless, its whispers sharper than before. "They come for us," it said. At first Kale thought it was only his nerves, but within days the proof appeared. Strange figures moved at the edges of camp, shadows too organized to be deserters. Scouts went missing. Patrols returned with wounded soldiers who claimed they had been ambushed by enemies using strange weapons. The war was supposed to be over, yet a new hunt had begun. One night, Kale woke to find his tent cut open. An intruder stood above him, a blade raised for the strike. Before Kale could even move, the rusty sword leapt into his hand, as if alive. It guided his arm, blocking the strike with unnatural speed. Sparks burst in the dark, and the intruder's eyes widened in fear. The whisper thundered in Kale's mind, "Strike, or be struck." Kale slashed, the old blade cutting through steel as if it were paper. The intruder fell, and the camp woke to chaos. From that night on, Kale was no longer a simple soldier. The sword had revealed its power, and others could no longer deny it. Some feared him, whispering that he was cursed. Others began to follow him, believing the Emperor's spirit had chosen Kale to lead. Whispers of loyalty spread, and with them came tension. The army's commanders grew uneasy. Kale was only a low-ranking fighter, yet men and women began to look to him instead of them. Every battle he fought ended with victory, the sword guiding his hand, its whispers sharp and sure. But for every follower Kale gained, more enemies arrived. Bands of mercenaries, old enemies of the Emperor's empire, even alien war bands from forgotten corners of space. They came not for Kale, but for the sword, the weapon that carried the soul of the Emperor. Kale fought them all, his fear replaced by a strange calm in battle. It was as if the blade wanted him to fight, wanted him to bleed, wanted him to prove himself. And with each victory, the whispers grew clearer, more commanding. "Bring me back," it said. Yet Kale could not shake the doubts that grew in his heart. In the visions, the Emperor stood tall, proud, and unstoppable, but his eyes burned with fire too fierce to be called mercy. What if the Emperor's return did not mean salvation, but domination? What if Kale was not chosen to protect his people, but to enslave them? These thoughts haunted him, even as the sword's whispers pushed him onward. Still, he could not abandon it. The blade was bound to him, and he to it. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Kale stood alone at the edge of the battlefield. The sword hummed in his hand, glowing faintly in the fading light. Behind him, soldiers whispered his name like a banner, some with hope, others with fear. Before him, he saw dust rising, enemies gathering once more. The whispers inside him grew louder. "This is only the beginning. Kale tightened his grip on the sword, his heart heavy with the weight of choice. The Emperor's shadow was spreading, and Kale knew there was no turning back. The days after the ambush changed everything for Kale. He was no longer just a soldier with a strange sword. He had become something more, something feared, something followed. Men and women who once ignored him now gathered at his side. They saw the blade in his hand, the glow that seemed to grow stronger with every battle. And they began to whisper that perhaps destiny itself had chosen him. Kale did not ask for followers, but they came anyway. Wounded soldiers, deserters, and even villagers who had survived the war. They followed him into the ruins, listening to the whispers of his courage, not knowing the true whispers came from the sword. With their help, Kale uncovered old technology buried beneath the rubble. Hidden shelters, energy sources, and weapons left behind by those who once served the Emperor. The blade guided him to each discovery, pulling him deeper into the past. At night, he dreamed of the Emperor's throne, and every morning he awoke more certain that the sword was leading him towards something greater. Yet with each new discovery, unease grew in Kale's heart. The visions became clearer, sharper, harder to ignore. He saw the Emperor's face now, no longer just a shadow. His features were noble, his presence commanding, but his eyes glowed with a cruel fire. The sword whispered of glory, of power, of victory that would last for eternity. But Kale wondered, was it glory for his people, or only for the Emperor? He began to fear the whispers, even as he depended on them. The small group of rebels that followed him grew stronger. They raided enemy camps, striking swiftly, always guided by the sword. Each victory pulled more survivors to Kale's side. But each victory also drew the attention of greater enemies. Alien mercenaries came in larger numbers, their leaders speaking of ancient oaths sworn to prevent the Emperor's return. Kale's followers asked why the enemy feared him so much. Some believed it was proof that Kale was their savior. Others whispered that perhaps the fear was justified. Tension grew within the group. One night a soldier named Ren confronted Kale by the fire. "Are we following you? Or are we following that cursed blade?" he demanded. Kale had no answer. He stared at the sword lying across his lap, its surface glowing faintly, and wondered the same thing. The whispers answered for him. "They follow me, and through me, they follow you." Kale clenched his teeth, pushing the voice aside, but its truth lingered in his mind. As weeks passed, Kale's name spread across the war-torn land. Enemies spoke it with fear, allies with hope. He was no longer Kale the soldier. He was Kale the chosen. Everywhere he went, people knelt before him, calling him the hand of the Emperor. Kale tried to resist the title, but the sword hummed with approval each time it was spoken. "Accept it," the whispers said. "You are nothing without me, and I am nothing without you." The storm rose not just on the battlefield, but inside Kale himself. He wanted to protect his people, to give them peace after endless war. But the sword wanted war, it wanted fire and conquest. The visions showed him galaxies burning, enemies kneeling, worlds bowing before a single throne. And in those visions Kale stood beside the Emperor, sometimes as a servant, sometimes as an heir. The thought terrified him, yet it also tempted him. For the first time in his life, Kale felt the pull of true power. One night, as rain poured over the ruins, Kale stood alone, the blade in his hand. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant he saw the reflection of the Emperor in the water pooling at his feet. Not a shadow, not a vision, but a clear figure standing behind him. The whispers thundered in his mind, louder than the storm. Soon, Kale tightened his grip on the sword, his heart torn between fear and desire. Behind him, his followers waited for his command. Before him, enemies gathered in greater numbers than ever before. The rising storm could no longer be stopped. It would either crown Kale as a savior, or break him as the Emperor's puppet. The storm outside grew stronger, but the greater storm raged inside Kale. The sword no longer whispered softly. It shouted, its voice echoing in his mind like thunder. Every step he took, every thought he tried to form, was weighed down by the Emperor's presence. Sometimes Kale could not tell where his own will ended and the blade's will began. His body felt weaker, yet his strikes in battle grew sharper, faster, almost impossible. It was as if the sword was slowly taking more of him while giving him more power in return. His followers noticed the change. Some praised it, calling him blessed by the Emperor, chosen to carry the spirit of a ruler too great to die. Others feared him, whispering that his eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, that his voice carried a second tone when he spoke. Even his closest allies began to look at him differently. One night, Rin, the soldier who had once questioned him, stepped forward again. "Kale, we follow you. But if you become nothing more than that blade's puppet, then who are we fighting for?" Kale had no answer, only silence, while the sword hissed in his mind. "He doubts you. Silence him." Kale refused, but resisting grew harder each day. The Emperor's spirit pressed closer, shaping Kale's dreams into commands. The visions no longer showed only the past. They showed the future. Worlds bending the knee, armies chanting Kale's name, the Emperor's shadow standing tall behind him. But they also showed destruction, endless wars, and chains binding humanity to a throne of fire. Kale woke from these dreams trembling, afraid of what choice he would be forced to make. The final push came when their enemies returned in force. Armies united not by alliance, but by fear of the Emperor's return. Alien warlords, mercenary bands, even humans who had once been Kale's allies, all marched together against him. They feared the sword more than they hated each other. Kale's camp grew restless, torn between the hope of victory and the fear of doom. The whispers inside him grew into a roar. "This is the moment. Raise me, call my name. Let me live again." The battle that followed was unlike anything Kale had faced. The enemy came in waves, crashing against his small force. His followers fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, their lines breaking, their cries filling the air. Kale stood in the center, the sword glowing brighter than ever. It moved with him. No, it moved for him, slicing through armor, burning through shields. Each strike left a trail of light. Each cry of the fallen echoed with the Emperor's laughter. Kale felt his strength draining, his body growing weaker, but the sword grew stronger. The Emperor's voice thundered, "Let go, and I will take your place. Together we will be unstoppable." Kale fell to his knees as the battle raged. The sword pulsed in his hand, light spilling across the field like a rising sun. His followers cried out to him, some begging him to lead, others begging him to stop. Enemies shouted that the Emperor must never rise again. And in that moment, Kale realized the truth. The sword did not just want to guide him, it wanted to consume him. If he gave in, the Emperor would return fully, wearing Kale's body as his vessel. Kale's soul would vanish, replaced by the will of a long-dead conqueror. Tears burned in his eyes, his heart heavy with the weight of choice. He could save his people by giving himself up, but at what cost? Would they be free, or would they trade one war for another under the Emperor's rule? The whispers demanded an answer, roaring louder than the cries of battle. Decide now. Kale gripped the blade tighter, his knuckles white, his body trembling. His choice would decide not only his fate, but the fate of everyone who followed him. The battlefield froze in his mind, every sound fading until only the sword's voice remained. Kale closed his eyes, and for the first time he spoke back with his full voice. "I am not your puppet," he said, his words shaking but firm. The sword screamed inside him, the Emperor's rage burning like fire. But Kale held on, refusing to bow, refusing to let go of himself. The whispers turned into a storm, 1,000 voices clashing in his mind. And Kale realized that the true battle was not against the armies before him. It was against the blade in his hand, against the Emperor demanding his soul. The battlefield burned, smoke curling into the sky like black wings. Kale knelt in the center, his body broken, the sword glowing with fierce light in his hands. The Emperor's voice thundered inside him, demanding, commanding, unrelenting. "Give yourself to me, and together we shall rise." Kale's heart pounded like a drum, his body weak, but his spirit fought harder than ever. He would not give in, not completely, yet the choice was no longer simple. The armies closed in around him, blades raised, voices shouting, desperate to end what they feared most. To them, Kale was no longer a soldier. He was the vessel of an ancient conqueror, and if they killed him, perhaps the Emperor would be lost forever. But Kale's followers cried out too. They shouted his name, not the Emperor's, their voices filled with faith and hope. They did not want an emperor. They wanted Kale, the man who had fought beside them, bled beside them, led them when all seemed lost. And Kale knew then what he must do. He gripped the sword with both hands, his arms trembling. The whispers screamed, clawing at his mind. But Kale shouted back with a voice louder than the storm. "I am Kale, not your shadow, not your puppet. If you live again, it will not be as my master." The sword pulsed violently, cracks of golden light splitting across its rusty surface. The battlefield froze as enemies and allies alike turned to watch. The blade screamed, a sound of metal and fury, of a spirit breaking free. Kale roared and drove the sword into the ground. Light exploded outward, flooding the field with brilliance. The shockwave threw soldiers off their feet, silenced the clash of battle. And in the center of it all, the Emperor appeared, not as flesh, not as bone, but as a towering figure of spirit and fire. His armor glowed, his eyes burned like stars, his presence heavy enough to bow the air itself. The soldiers on both sides fell to their knees, some in fear, some in awe. The Emperor looked down at Kale, his expression unreadable. "You defied me," he said, his voice both thunder and whisper. Kale, trembling but unbroken, lifted his head. "I chose my own path," he replied. The Emperor studied him, and for the first time his voice softened. "Then you're not merely my vessel. You are my heir." The battlefield grew silent. The Emperor did not return as a tyrant of flesh, nor as a master seeking chains. He returned as a spirit bound to Kale, a shadow tied not to conquest alone, but to choice. The sword, now shattered, lay in pieces around them, its prison broken, its power released. The Emperor's form flickered, no longer whole, no longer the ruler he once was. But his presence lingered, a force that would never fade. "The Emperor lives again," he said, his voice echoing across the field, not in steel, not in shadow, but in the hearts of those who choose to rise. Kale stood, though his body screamed with pain. His followers rushed to him, some weeping, some cheering. The enemies who had come to destroy him lowered their blades, uncertain of what they had just witnessed. The storm above broke, rain falling hard, washing blood and ash from the ground. Kale looked at the broken sword and then at the fading figure of the Emperor. He knew this was not the end, only the beginning. The Emperor's power was alive, but it no longer belonged to a single man. It belonged to all who carried the courage to resist chains. Kale raised his voice to the soldiers, his words echoing across the soaked battlefield. "We are not slaves to the past, nor servants to a shadow. The Emperor may live again, but so do we, free to choose, free to fight, free to stand." The men and women around him lifted their heads, their voices rising in unison. For the first time in years, the battlefield did not echo with fear, but with hope. Kale had not destroyed the Emperor, nor had he surrendered to him. He had become something new, something greater, a bridge between the past and the future, a living reminder that even the whispers of ancient power could not silence the will of the human spirit. And as the last echo of light faded from the shattered sword, the final whisper returned, soft and eternal. "The Emperor lives again.